was our speaker's idea not to have a podium. I feel a little bit too close to the crowd, but he's much more comfortable with that. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Tahir Andrawi. I'm the Dean of the LUMS School of Education. And this is part of our EduSpeak series where we try to get at issues of policy interests, sometimes complicated issues in education, and reach out to bring those issues not just to our own faculty, students, and the LUMS community, or even the policymakers, but just to the general public. I think the issues of education and the issues of education, particularly in Pakistan, are so important and how we deal with it that they cannot be left just to the experts. I think it is really important to have a conversation, to develop concepts and ideas so that we can bring them about in terms of a public discourse. So part of our role as a university at LUMS is to really also engage with the public in order to enhance our discourse. So when you look at the title, the term is used, learning crisis. And I just don't think I can get a person better than our current speaker, Lant Pritchett. Lant Pritchett has been associated with a number of universities and institutions. He did his PhD in economics from MIT and worked with the World Bank, where he became very influential in thinking about global economic growth and issues of convergence and development of developing countries or divergence between rich and poor countries. He did some very influential work on global labor mobility, particularly in thinking about migration borders and why that was such a big distortion in the world economy on restrictions on migration. He became very known for his work. Both of these points, this is before the current emphasis on inequality. He was one of the first ones to talk about that the global economy was diverging and not converging between rich and poor. A novel idea when he first started writing on it. Again, kind of pre-stated his current anti-immigration and anti-migration stand, which is happening in the world right over, and argued against it before it became a thing. So for the last 15 years or so, he's been thinking about education. He moved from the World Bank to Harvard, where at Harvard Kennedy School, he was an architect responsible for developing, which is now considered a flagship program in public policy, on an MPA, Master's in Public Administration in International Development, at Harvard Kennedy School, where he was there for over a decade. And for the last few years, he's been at Oxford, where he is part of the head of the intellectual leadership team and the research director of this large research program, multi-country, called Research in Systems of Education, which is doing large-scale research in 7 countries, including Pakistan.
It's not on yet.
I think Lant has been a force and commitment and passion for education, and particularly about learning. And that I don't want to take your punchline away, but one of the things that he talks about is that systems of education are coherent around lots of different things, but maybe not coherent around learning. So I think there is a global focus of bringing learning back towards the center of the educational enterprise. And Lant, I think, has been very influential and educational in doing so. I have to thank a lot of people for this event and acknowledge the Harvard Club of Pakistan, Shanza. They are not here yet. They got stopped somewhere on the way or something. And the Oxbridge Society. They kind of do their events together. So I think that Lant is appropriate, right? Having taught both at Harvard and Oxford, so if they needed one person for these societies. The Research in Systems of Education, the RISE program in Pakistan, is being managed by CERP, and I think they are here and were responsible for helping us bring Lant to Pakistan. We have the School of Education and a lot of school-based partners, and many of them are here, and I want to thank you. And finally, I would like to also thank, we have a number of prospective students for our MPhil in Educational Leadership and Management who are in the crowd, and I welcome all of them. So without further ado, I would like to now ask Lant to come to the podium. And Lant, you have about an hour and a half, 45 minutes or so of talk, and I'll let you take it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back here in Pakistan and back at LUMS. 4 years ago, I gave a talk in LUMS about economic growth and promoting economic growth, and as Tahir was saying, my research interests and practical interests have shifted towards education, and I have 50 minutes to convince you there's a very serious problem, to convince you that nearly everything you hear about how to solve that serious problem is wrong and won't work and will just waste time and money, and then to try and outline for you an approach that I think will work. So, big agenda. The basic storyline is that there's really been an amazing, impressive, transformational success. History has been changed in the last 50 or 60 years with the expansion of schooling. Nearly every child in the world didn't go to school 50 years ago. Nearly every child in the world goes to school, mostly for extended periods today. So if you had to point to what has happened in my lifetime of 60 years, I was born in 1959, that has transformed the world, certainly the transformation that nearly every child is in school is one of the amazing human successes that we've accomplished in my lifetime. However, education outcomes are not at all what we hoped they would be from that transformation. There was always a goal for universal education. Universal education meant children would emerge from schooling equipped with the skills, competencies, and capabilities they needed to be successful adults across the whole array. This isn't just about human capital for economic production. It was better citizens, better parents, better at everything. That, however, has been impressively disappointing. Children are learning incredibly less in school than I think anyone ever anticipated. The third part of the storyline is fixing that is not going to be possible with piecemeal reform. A system that was constructed around alignment of the system to expand access is not well equipped and not fit for purpose with delivering universal quality. And so you really have to think of a systematic transformation from a system aligned for access that is just pushing bricks, mortar, butts in seats, bodies in schools, into an entirely different configuration of the system it will take to actually create quality learning for all. So the success and expansion, I think all of us kind of know this, but it's truly impressive. And by the way, I'm going to strive not to use the word Pakistan in this presentation, because all of you know more about Pakistan than I do. I'm going to use mostly evidence and examples for other countries and let you assess to what extent Pakistan is like that, for the most part. But, for instance, Bangladesh has a year and a half, the typical adult in Bangladesh has a year and a half more schooling than a typical Frenchman did in 1960. That's really amazing. Like, France in 1960 thought of itself, at least, I'm an American so I'm skeptical, thought of itself as an advanced civilized society. Bangladesh has more education than a typical Frenchman. Already in 2010, it's even more so today. So the expansion of access has been amazing. The poorest, some of the poorest countries in the world, like Haiti and Bangladesh, already have far more time spent in school for children and hence higher average schooling attainment of adults than the developed world did not that long ago. So, but youth are definitely not emerging from their schooling prepared for their adult lives in any way, shape, or form. And I want to emphasize, I'm going to give you a few just illustrative facts. Mostly what I'm doing this speech is not giving you compelling evidence. I'm just trying to illustrate the points I make. For any point I make, I can hopefully generate 6 or 7 or 8 pieces of evidence, but I'm trying to give you just illustrative things. So, there's a real learning crisis, and I want to emphasize the learning crisis goes from bottom to top. This is not that, oh yes, the poorest of the poor in rural schools are getting a bad education. They're getting no education at all, and the elite are getting a bad education, for the most part. And, if we look at the skills youth have as they emerge from the schooling system, they're just radically inconsistent with the expectations that have been created. So youth are being told, go to school and your life opportunities will be completely different, but they're not, in fact, being equipped with the skills they need to make those opportunities realized. So this is, I want to show this graph because this graph is a device that we use. This is just the fraction of adult women who can read a single sentence in any language according to a household survey that's done around the world. And on the axis is the percent of women who can read, and on the horizontal axis is the years they've spent in school. So this is what we call a learning profile. It's just the association between a skill set you have and how long you've spent in school. One would hope that around the world this would look like this curve, that by about 4th grade, nearly all children would be able to read and would retain that skill of reading into adulthood. That's not what it looks like. What it looks like is in some countries, even women who've completed 6 or 8 years of schooling can't read a single sentence. They don't retain anything of literacy skills from those many years of exposure. And this is the line, turns out, this line is Kenya. So this is what a kind of African country can do. This line is both, by the way, the average and Pakistan. So about half, according to this data, about half of young adult Pakistani women could read a single sentence having completed 6 years of schooling, which means half of them couldn't. Half of them went to school day after day, hour after hour for 6 years and didn't emerge from that even able to read a single simple sentence like farming is hard work. This isn't a probe of sophisticated literacy, able to read and analyze. This is just, can you decode a sentence? So the ASER organization in India, who has a counterpart, a broader movement and a counterpart here in Pakistan as well, did a survey of 14 to 18-year-olds across rural India a few years ago, and they asked this question in this way. This is a picture. Here's a girl. She goes to sleep at 9:30 p.m. She wakes up at 6:30 a.m. How many hours did this girl sleep? I actually want you to fill in this table. Of the youth with less than 8 years, how many do you think got it right? Youth with 8 or more years. Youth that were enrolled as an undergraduate. Like, it would be better if you took out a pencil and pen, because if not, you're all going to lie and say, oh, yeah, I knew that. Just think or write down or text yourself. What do you think these are? I'm actually going to give you a few minutes to think about, what do I think about what fraction of youth are able to do this simple thing? So, only about a quarter of kids who, didn't go all the way through school can answer this question, 26%. But about half of all youth enrolled in college couldn't answer that question. That's shocking. That is radically unprepared and a radical disjunction between the expectations that are being created about the kind of job, about the kind of future one is going to have because one has persisted through schooling, and the actual preparation and skill set that's being acquired. Just radically unprepared. Because this question isn't even addition. You could work this out on your fingers and get it right. It's not even an equation. It's not even arithmetic. It's just, can I use time usefully? And, only the difference between those who didn't go to school and those who did just is amazingly small. And I call this the Great Betrayal. These youth are being betrayed. They're being told, go to school, go to school, go to school, go to school, you'll be ready, you'll get a good job, you'll have a bright future, and they are not being equipped with the skills they need. And I want to emphasize that this is not just in the developing world. There is a feeling that, oh, the first-time learners, those with illiterate parents, they're struggling in school. Of course, they're struggling in school. But the elite are doing okay. Not true. Not true. This is data from Indonesia. Indonesia takes PISA every round of PISA, which is an international exam that compares countries around the world. India does about 400 on a scale where 500 is the typical rich country. So they do about the same as an average middle-income country. They do about the same as Brazil or Argentina or, middle-income country. And yet when they tested adult literacy in the OECD, those who in Jakarta had a tertiary education complete had lower adult literacy by far than a high school dropout in Japan. So the elite who were living in the capital city, having completed college, actually had literacy skills lower than about the same as the typical high school dropout throughout the OECD. So the fact that there was a massive expansion in college graduates doesn't actually tell you what the capabilities are. The college graduates still have roughly high school dropout capabilities in literacy. So this is not just a learning crisis of poor, rural. This is the fact that the education system across the board is churning out people with very low levels of skills. There's kind of 4 strategies that are super popular. Advocates around the world are going to tell you these are going to work, and they're just not going to work. The first is sort of wait and see. Oh, we're a poor country, but everything gets better with time. We're kind of having some economic growth. We're having some other transformation, technology. Well, it turns out when you do the calculation of the typical pace of improvement of a developing country on a scale where the rich countries are about 500 and a standard deviation is about 100, the typical country is making progress at about 1 point a year. My guess is if Pakistan did PISA today, they would be about 350. I'm just guessing, but it's a super informed guess. Which means the wait and see is going to take you about 150 years for Pakistani children to be at the current level of the OECD. Which doesn't mean your children are going to get an education, your grandchildren aren't going to get a good education, your great-grandchildren aren't going to get a good education. You're looking into the 6 generations out before just wait and see general progress is going to lift up the education system. It's actually going to require concerted effort to accelerate the pace of progress. Second, the answer is more schooling. Well, okay, if I'm walking up a shallow ramp and want to get high, I just have to walk further. So, yeah, I'm not learning very much in primary school, so I'm not getting very educated, but I'll just universalize secondary, and then maybe I'll continue to expand and universalize tertiary, and I'll just do longer and longer longer and longer in school in order to get cohorts better equipped. Problem is, that's almost certainly not going to work for 2 reasons. One, and somehow this graph shifted when I cut and pasted it, but it illustrates the point. One, Indonesia, which is a country in many ways probably slightly ahead of Pakistan in terms of income per capita and maybe some other dimensions, has just run an experiment for the world in which they have, in fact, between 2000 and 2014, the 14 years, the fraction fraction of the youth population that was completing universal secondary went from about 40 to 60. So massive expansion in the number of children who were completing completing secondary. You would think this would increase the capacity of the youth cohort, that we would see measured improvements in their skills. The problem is these lines are the difference in being able to answer some simple arithmetic questions with people at various levels of schooling. What you see is it's just a very shallow ramp. And it got a little bit worse. So the net result of Indonesia expanding completion of secondary school by 20 percentage points is that the average ability of a youth to answer some simple arithmetic questions fell. So if you said, don't worry, our youth really aren't equipped for the modern world, they can't do simple arithmetic, we'll just keep them in school longer, doesn't work. It didn't work, at least in Indonesia, because the amount they were learning, and this was the first graph I was showing you, tapered off. They stopped learning in 6th grade. So this is the average ability to answer the question from grades 2 to 6, and from 6 through to 11, and then it pops up at 12, probably because they're cramming for the exam. But fortunately, they forget that very fast. So when you interview them later, you basically see that pushing kids through more and more school when they didn't get an adequate foundation early doesn't help at all. So anyone who tells you that don't worry about the learning crisis, look, we're rapidly expanding, number of kids going to secondary school, colleges are rapidly expanding, not going to work. Not going to really make a big dent in the average skills of youth. So let me go back. The third thing is more of the same. And I use India's big program called SSA as an example. Just because I'm in Pakistan, I figure using India as an example of failure will be much more popular than using anything from Pakistan. But SSA was a quite typical program. It said, let's devote a lot more money. Let's create a management system that tracks where the money goes. Let's push the money through inputs. Let's build boundary walls. Let's build girls' toilets. Let's provide more books on time. Perfectly standard approach. What happened in India is they, in fact, accomplished all of their input goals and none of their learning goals. So this is data from the government's data that shows that, between 2004, 5, and 11, 12, class sizes fell from 55 to 29. Schools with girls' toilet went from 25 to 73. Schools with drinking water went from 80 to 100. Kind of judged as the programmatic objectives of spending inputs, huge success. In the meantime, the average learning of kids in government schools fell. And 1 million less kids were in government schools. So during the whole period in which the expansion of input strategy was succeeding, people were voting massively with their feet out of the government sector, and the measured learning of children in the government schools was falling continuously. So it wasn't, in fact, making any dent at all in the learning crisis. So, and then the fourth thing that you might hear is that, well, what we need in order to improve the education system is tighter, top-down, what I would call logistical control of the system. We're just not managing the system tight enough. Dashboards, we need data, we need analytics, we need all of that. I think, again, SSA is an example in some sense of this tighter top-down control, but I think lots of places have done that, and it just doesn't work, in part because if you think about the way a functional organization works because the organization has a clear purpose. People in the organization understand the kind of unique selling point of the organization. This is why my organization is important and what it does in the world. And they understand their contribution to the organization. And organizationally, the rest of all of that is support to purpose. HR exists to support the purpose of the organization. Accounting exists to buy the stuff the organization needs to fulfill its purpose. Once you get to a dysfunctional organization that has lost its core sense of purpose, clear sense of how they're going to accomplish the purpose, clear sense of each individual in the organization of how they're contributing to the purpose, these support functions basically become carnivores or cannibals that feed off the remaining organization. It's like HR in a dysfunctional organization can follow the rules of HR, but it doesn't improve the organization. Stronger accounting can keep an organization from spending money, but it can't make the organization spend money better. So across the board, stronger kind of control around an organization who's had its purpose hollowed out and doesn't have clear purpose cannot fix it. I work on building organizational capability, and we have a very clear phrase for this that involves animal analogies so people remember it. You can't beat a turtle to move. Organizations that have become dysfunctional and have survived as dysfunctional relative to a clear purpose for any length of time have done so because they have a very hard external shell to being forced from the outside. A turtle survives because you can grab a stick, you can beat a turtle, you'll be tired of beating the turtle before the turtle is tired of being beaten. You will go on your way, the turtle will be unchanged and go on its way. So organizations that have hollowed out their internal purpose core cannot be fixed by outside intervention that attempts tight logistical control. You can't restore purpose with data. Data can support purpose, but it can't create purpose. Another way I put this is you can't make Pinocchio into a real boy by adding more strings. You can add more strings and make a better puppet, but you can't make Pinocchio a real boy with IT, with more strings, with more tight control over their actions. So this leads to a set of what I think are some pretty hard messages. They're hard messages that, first of all, that really countries with mediocre to poor current learning profiles in which we're not getting the universal early basic mastery of skills have to focus on that. Everything else has to be regarded as secondary. Enrollment expansion, tertiary vocational training, 21st century skills. I think all of that is super trendy, super wah in international forum. It's not going to do you any good. What kind of vocational training are you going to give to somebody who's finished high school and can't tell time? You can't fix at the end what has got broken early on. And there's lots of popular things and trendy things to do about the education system, but they're going to absorb time, attention, focus, budget, and not fix the core problem, and without fixing the core problem. Third, you really have to incorporate the hard message that improvement is going to be hard. And we know improvement's going to be hard because we've seen so little of it. And so it is not as if other countries and Pakistan haven't made efforts that were nominally aimed at improving education outcomes. And if we haven't succeeded yet, we should expect what we need to do to succeed to be hard. They say one of the definitions of crazy is doing the same thing and expecting different results. If you haven't been producing results so far with what's been done, you should expect to do something different, and you probably should expect it to be quite different, not just a little bit different. And it has to start from realism about the challenges. Lots of education reforms that are popular in the world tell you how to get from Finland's performance in 2004 to Finland's performance in 2010. That's really cool, really interesting if you're Finland in 2004. But you're not Finland in 2004. And so the Finnish miracle is just not that relevant for you. And I think this is going to be resisted. And then finally, equality and inclusion are potentially important agendas, but there's a range of systems around the world. In the poorest functioning systems in the world, there's nothing to be included into. Why would we be focused on inclusion into a system that is not producing learning? And again, I'm all for achieving universal enrollment. I'm all for every child having an opportunity to go to school. But we got to recognize that, again, most of these countries do not have the problem that there's a really spectacular, well-functioning, high-performing education system to which some kids are being denied access. There's a really poorly performing system across the whole range of abilities. And overall, that needs to improve if the society is going to improve. This is not a problem that can be ignored by anybody because, and again, I'm not they recently in Zambia and other countries around the world, they did a simpler equivalent of PISA. And when you calculate how many kids, there's 360,000 kids in a cohort of 15-year-olds in Zambia. If you take these numbers and look at the distribution of performance and say the top three levels of PISA, levels 4, 5, 6, usually have about 30% of the 15-year-old population in an OECD country. So if you had 360,000 kids in an OECD country, about 120,000 of them would be level 4, 5, 6. In Zambia, not 5%. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 kids were at levels 4, 5, 6. Total. So, does Zambia have an inclusion problem? Maybe yes, maybe no. But if only 5 kids are at level 4, 5, 6, the elite of the elite of the elite aren't at level 4, 5, 6. So it also has a quality problem. There is a learning crisis at the top, too. So now, what needs to happen to make sustained gains, in my view, and now I'm going to argue what I think will work. I've argued that there is a crisis. I've argued that most of the standard remedies that would be popular and that maybe some of the donors as a vector of dissemination of bad ideas are bringing to you would tell you to do. I'm trying to convince you those are unlikely to work in and of themselves. And again, I think this should be a pretty easy persuasion because you've probably tried them and they haven't worked. So predicting that they won't work in future is a pretty good bet. Okay. Now but since what I'm going to tell you is going to seem implausible and difficult and complicated, I'm setting you up for that by saying you should expect to see what will work to be quite different from and harder than what you've done so far, right? If I started with the 30 minutes I've given you so far and then gave you some easy answer, I think all of you in the audience are like, well, that was dumb. He just said this is really hard and complicated and difficult problem and then gave me an easy answer. That's snake oil, right? So what needs to happen is the creation of an education system coherent around learning goals. Now, that simple sentence embeds tons and tons and tons of complexity. So I want to unpack some of that complexity, and I'm going to unpack it in 3 levels. First of all, what would a learning goal-oriented system look like? What would a learning goal around which one could build a coherent system look like? Second, what do I mean by a system? The word system is a popular word to use when you don't know what the hell else to say and it's just complicated. But I have something very specific I mean by a system. I'm not just bluffing. And then what does a coherent system mean versus an incoherent system? And again, I have a very specific definition of coherent versus incoherent. So first, I think the learning goal I would recommend that most moderate to poor performing current countries focus on is universal, early, conceptual and procedural mastery of basic skills. And again, this might sound like a platitude, but this is not, in fact, what most education systems do in a variety of ways. So what do I mean by, in particular, I want to focus on that. What I'm arguing is we need more emphasis on conceptual mastery of basic skills. We don't need basic mastery of basic skills. We need conceptual mastery of basic skills. And that's a radically different thing. So what's the difference? If we ask mechanical questions about basic arithmetic, like write the answer to that well-specified multiplication problem, these are answers from India about 10 years ago. About half of Indian kids, I think these were in 5th grade, but I can't, not really sure, but the point is about half of the kids could answer a question that involved a purely procedural understanding of a basic skill. The algorithm of multiplication, they could only half of them mastered, so that's not terribly good, but it's somewhere. But then if we asked, how much more is 25 times 18 than 24 times 18? Now, if you look at it at first, it seems like a really hard problem. It looks like, holy smoly, I'm going to have to multiply 25 times 18, and I'm going to have to multiply 24 times 18, and then I'm going to have to subtract the difference. But some people are laughing because they realize, well, wait a second, multiplication is just counting by 18s. So the answer is 18. If you understood on a conceptual level multiplication, this is a super easy problem. If you just understand it algorithmically, it's a doable problem, but a difficult problem. But it's amazing that 48% could do the multiplication, only 21% on a multiple choice test with 4 options. So this is less than guessing. Less kids got this right than had they guessed. And again, it's just, you might think this is a trick question, but it's a conceptual probing question. Do you understand how multiplication works? That it's just skip counting, right? It's just counting by 18s. And again, similar. They can calculate the perimeter. And so what happens is, by failing to get early conceptual mastery, it makes the entire rest of the education trajectory difficult to impossible. So when we looked at the fact that the learning profile flattened out in Indonesia, in large part it was because they didn't get conceptual mastery early, and then they just stopped making progress. So this is a question, again, that was designed to probe measurement. And they say the length of this line is 4 centimeters. How long is this pencil? And the easy, obvious answer is it's 6 centimeters long, because that's where the damn tip of the pencil is. And I was taught how long something is where its tip is. But all we've done is displace the pencil by a centimeter, and the right answer is 5. But you see that from 4th grade to 8th grade, the number of kids getting it right goes up, but only by about 10 percentage points. And even in kids in 8th grade, more kids get it wrong than right, because they never really got the concept of measurement. They got a rote procedural mastery in which if you gave them exactly the question that they had seen on their homework or the textbook, they could spit back to you exactly what you had given them. But if you complicated it in the simplest possible way, I mean, this is not, I didn't give you a curved object and ask how long it was. That's a hard problem, right? So again, universal early conceptual and procedural mastery of basic skills is actually the opposite of the way in which many of the current systems are designed. Many of the systems are designed as selection systems, not education systems. Our goal is to identify as quickly as possible the students who can give us the right answer to the things we feed them. We don't actually expect to teach kids underlying concepts. The system actually only, wow, I misspelled a word here, but the system are focused on late high-stakes assessments. We don't focus on early mastery. We focus on a grade 10 exam that separates sheep from goats. We don't focus on conceptual and procedural mastery. Too much is taught without any feedback on what's learned. When I visit classrooms and I ask them, can your students add fractions, for instance, the overwhelming answer I get is, yes, I taught them that. And I say, that's not what I asked. I asked, can they add fractions? I didn't ask whether you had shown them some lesson on adding fractions. And sure enough, in most classrooms I visit in low-performing systems, 5th graders can't add fractions at all. Like, they can't even begin to do it on the board. But too much is focused on what was taught, and so there's an emphasis on exposing children to a curriculum rather than actually generating conceptual. And curriculum tend to cover too many subjects with too many items within the subjects, not really leaving time for mastery of basics. And I want to show you kind of an interesting thing that, which is, this is from Uganda, and then I'm going to combine, this is not a thought experiment, I'm coming to the thought experiment. This is grade 1 to 3, 5 to 7, 13 to 15, and I love this chart because this is a list of topics, and this is the depth with which one is teaching those topics. And so they observe the classroom practice to say what was being taught and what level of understanding was being promoted. So, and these are heat maps, so the different colors were spent more of the time. Nearly all the time in the early grades was focused on memorization and procedural mastery of super basic arithmetic things. And then what you see happen is the curriculum continues to race across topics, but never gets to deeper conceptual mastery. This is what this is what we're trying to come up with, how to communicate this. This is lots of showing without any knowing. I've shown you statistics. I've shown you probability. I've shown you algebra. But whether or not you know algebra is not really being probed. So they're pushing teaching time down into these advanced topics. And they're never on any level getting over here. And only in grades 13 to 15 are they actually getting over to anything like conceptual mastery. So when you think about what it might mean to refocus on universal early basic mastery of conceptual and procedural mastery, rather than teaching racing ahead on narrow understanding, students need to get over here, and in a current system, teachers race through the curriculum, never get to the conceptual mastery, so no one essentially ends up down here. So when you then probe for sophisticated mastery of sophisticated concepts, it's just not there. This is why no one is at 4, 5, and 6. Because 4, 5, and 6 of PISA means I can manipulate sophisticated concepts in novel circumstances. But if you can't manipulate basic concepts in sophisticated circumstances, being exposed to more advanced concepts doesn't help. Okay, so I'm just thinking how much time you think I have. How much time do you think I have? She's looking at her watch. It's like, well, my time. I have
15 more minutes.
what? 15 more minutes. Perfect. Okay. With 15 more minutes, I can change your life. Some of you. Some of you, it's hopeless. So now I'm going to try to, okay, suppose we have now a clear concept of the learning goal we're trying to achieve. What we're trying to achieve in our education system is universal, inclusive, equality. We want every kid in Pakistan to be able to master these skills. We want conceptual and procedural mastery. We want them actually to understand stuff, not just be able to spit it back on rote memorization on a simple exam. And we want it to be focused on basic skills, on which is a scaffolding on which we can later build much more sophisticated skills as they go into higher grades. What is a system, and what does coherent of a system mean? So this is a graph of a system that is kind of generic around providing any service through government channels, and it can easily also apply to the private sector. But basically, what a system is it's the actors in the system and the connections between the actors. Right? If we say, what's a weather system? A weather system is the things involved in weather and the feedback loops among the elements of it. What's, an automobile is a system that has a bunch of elements and it has connections and feedback loops among the elements. An education system is a set of actors and connections among the actors. And we characterize a system as characterized by relationships of accountability, in which some people are going to be accountable to others. And so we start with citizens, parents, students. There's a relationship called politics, and through that relationship, they try and communicate to the state what they want. So there's a relationship of accountability between the state and its citizens. There's a relationship of accountability between the state and the organizations that do things on behalf of the state, like a Ministry of Education. The state communicates to the ministry, here is what we want. Then there's a management relationship whereby organizations try and or delegate to the frontline providers, the teachers, the principals, the headmasters, what in fact they want. And then there's a fourth relationship which we call client power, which is whereby the citizens, when they interact directly with the school, exercise accountability over the school. And each of those accountability relationships is characterized by 4 or 5 elements. And the reason why there's 4 or 5 is a little complicated. And we call those 4 elements delegation, finance, information, and motivation. If I want you to do something for me, I have to tell you what I want. And the clearer and more precisely I can tell you what I want, the more likely you're going to be able to do what I want. If I tell you to do something that's impossible, I have not created an effective relationship of accountability. You cannot be accountable to me to fly around the room. You know why? Because you can't fly around the room. So delegation has to be feasible, it has to be clear, it has to be achievable. Then there's finance. If I want you to do something for me, I have to pay you something, and I have to pay you enough to make it worth your while. And I have to equip you with the tools and conditions to do it. I can't demand of you that you educate children and not equip you with a school, not equip you with textbooks, not equip you with an adequate learning environment. Third, I need to collect information. I need to know whether you're doing a good job of what I delegated you to do. How do I know whether or not you're doing a good job? And then finally, I need motivation. I need it for it to be better for you if you do a good job than bad job. If you're better off when you do a bad job than a good job, it's not an effective relationship of accountability. So, what a system of education is characterized as a set of 4 relationships of accountability between different actors, where conceptually each of those relationships has design elements. So in the relationship of management, say between an organization, a schooling organization and a teacher, there's a delegation. I need the teacher to know what skills and capabilities I want the students to acquire. They need to know what it is that the child's supposed to know. Otherwise, they can't do a good job at meeting those goals. There has to be adequate finance. I have to equip the teacher with the resources they need in order to accomplish the goal. There has to be support, which is the 5th element, which I didn't name among the 4th elements. I have to equip the teacher with the training, skills, knowledge, abilities in order to accomplish the goal. I have to take joint responsibility for equipping the agent with the possibility of succeeding. If I don't provide support, I might put very high stakes on it, but I'll get failure anyway. I need information. I need to know, by the way, and in a rich and contextually appropriate way, how the performance is going. When I say the word information, I don't want you to think just bits and bytes and data. I want you to think, what is it I need to know in order to know whether the teacher's doing a good job? And then I need motivation. I want the teacher to be happier when she's doing a good job than bad job. That could be that she gets more money, could be that there's intrinsic rewards, could be that there's peer effects, could be anything. I'm not saying pay for performance. I'm saying motivation. In most successful organizations, most people are motivated by purpose. And when they have a clear purpose communicated to them and are equipped for the purpose and are allowed to accomplish the purpose, they feel better about themselves. So I'm not saying pay for performance. I'm saying they should be motivated by purpose. So this, now a coherent system is one in which these relationships of accountability are individually coherent and mutually coherent. So let me talk about the ways in which most systems are incoherent, and it's the incoherence that often leads to failure. The first way is there's a cell-by-cell incoherence of the column. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that I have teacher training that is completely disarticulated from the classroom experience of the teacher and the goals that the teacher has. The teacher can't see the relationship between the support they're receiving via training and the goals that I have laid out for them and their experience. So that's incoherence between the support and the delegation. And then if you or there's incoherence between delegation and finance. I say I want every children to learn, but I don't provide adequate learning materials for that every child can learn. Then there's incoherence between what I say I want you to do and what you can see that I'm really willing to provide you to do, right? There's incoherence of delegation and information. I tell you, by the way, I want every child to learn, but by the way, spend some hours every week collecting data on a whole bunch of ancillary things that you know aren't sharply related to child learning performance. Or spend hours a week on these tasks that you know aren't tightly related. So I'm telling you, and hence I'm collecting information on a whole bunch of stuff that you know, and I'm chewing up your time to collect information that isn't relevant to your performance. And it's not aligned with delegation. So that's, and again, I'm going to skim very lightly over this, but this is developed in some detail in publications. The second incoherence is between the same element across relationships, which is, and again, I don't think we just spent the morning in some sense discussing this, which is, think about the information that the teacher might need in order to actually teach a pupil, which is actual formative assessment of the child's progress on the delegated concepts, and the information that's collected by an high-stakes examination system that asks a set of very narrow, rote, procedural, high-stakes questions. So there's an incoherence between the information that is collected at the system level and the information needed at the management level. And what is the teacher supposed to respond to? What is the information relative to judging his or her performance? If, in fact, they're told one thing about the curricular objectives, that we're intending to spark creativity and analytical thinking, but they know that the only high-stakes thing is an examination that tests only rote mastery, it's incoherence in the information collected. And so when you look at the information that exists in the political sphere, that exists between the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Education, that exists between the management of the ministry and the teachers, and that exists between the parents, there's often complete incoherence in who knows what and how they understand it. And then third, there's incoherence between entire relationships. Meaning, and usually who bears the brunt of this incoherence is teachers. So often teachers feel both trapped in a strong accountability relationship between the ministry, which is super interested in process compliance and certain aspects of monitoring them, and the parents who actually want the teachers to be accountable for providing a good education to their own child. And so the entire client accountability relationship and the ministry management relationship are misaligned on the backs of teachers. So teachers are unresponsive to parents in order to be accountable to what the accountability of the relationship is vis-a-vis the organization they're embedded in, when it is not aligned with the actual needs and wants of the parents. So 3 types of incoherence, and I think this system coherence as an organizing principle is super important to thinking through reforms. Because mostly what happens in thinking through education reforms is that you gather a group of experts on teacher training, and they discuss teacher training. And you gather a group of experts on textbook design, and they discuss textbook design. You gather a group of experts on assessment, and they discuss assessment. And whether or not those actually constitute a coherent set of objectives and a coherent set of achievable things that a typical teacher in Pakistan could implement in the typical classroom in Pakistan and have success against a clear and understood goal for the education system is never discussed. So coherence isn't discussed. And then secondly, coherence isn't discussed system-wide in the sense that do we as a society have a clear set of objectives that we as citizens of the state, as the Ministry of Education, and as parents are all willing to stick to as a reasonably coherent, and I'm using the word coherent because it's not perfectly aligned. Every society has divisions and disagreements about relative priorities, but is there a reasonably coherent, learning-oriented set of objectives for the education system around which individual decisions about the system can be taken? And so let me conclude. Schooling succeeded in expanding schooling because systems were coherent around expanding access. They delegated access, they financed access, they collected information on access, they motivated around access. And they succeeded at access. Now we need a radical transformation from organizations aligned around access to education systems coherent for learning. Thank you very much.
What?
you want to take questions yourself, or do you want me to take them?
I think I'll take questions, although I was thinking earlier, usually Q&A is really CNR. It's called Q&A, but it's usually comment and response. So often people, their question doesn't end with an inflection of their voice and a question mark. So I'm happy to handle the comment and response myself.
So listen, I think that, questions...
You like questions?
Questions should end with a question mark. And what I'll do is take...
There's microphones that
we... brief. Yes, I want to cut you down. Okay.
Right. Thank you. It was very nice to learn from you. I am a philanthropist, politician and businessman. US is my second home. I often travel.
Oh.
2 questions, okay. Not directly related to your presentation, but of course related to education. Number 1, you mentioned about politicians and policymakers. How can we convince our politicians and policymakers who have been themselves through the best education institutes in their lives and their children as well, but not thinking about the oppressed or the marginalized kids, 20-25 million not going to school? Secondly, universities like LUMS and other good universities, how can we motivate and bring something in these students that they can go forward in future and do something for those 20-24 million kids who do not go to school? Last, I started 6 years back probably the first foster care in Pakistan, which is being run by myself and the Frenchman who is LGS Johor Town principal since 32 years. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
I'll take 1 or 2 more questions if there are any others. Yes, ma'am.
And you see how polite it was that I just put my hearing aids in, because earlier I didn't care what you said, but now I'm willing to listen.
All right, it's a pleasure listening to you today because I have 2 little daughters who go to school here, so it was really informative. I was just wondering if there can be a scale or some sort of rating that can be assigned to different schools for parent decision making with all of the indicators that you've stated, like delegation is important, information is important, accountability is important, right? So if there's an organization or individuals who can work on that and have some questionnaires, ask parents, the management, and get some sort of a rating scale out, like you have in finance with bonds, credit ratings, so you can make an informed decision whether you can go to schools, and parents can make that informed decision for their children.
Okay, why don't you answer, please?
Okay. So I think the answer to the first is I think the main way to get politicians interested is, in some sense, to start with the relevant information getting on the table. So I think I was working in India 15 years ago on education. There was zero traction because the government dominated. This should still be on. Isn't this on? Yeah. Okay. So because the government had dominated the information sources about quality of learning so completely, there wasn't any citizen action because they thought, oh, we're getting a school, blah, blah, blah. I think over the last 15 years, it's radically changed night and day. So the first thing is to create measures of performance that citizens care about and have citizens make sure they have independent sources of information on which they can hold them accountable. And second, I think it really needs a society-wide discussion about the future such that people really do start to say, the future of Pakistan doesn't depend on how much schooling our kids get. The future of Pakistan depends on the education our kids get, and embedded in a global economy, as every economy is today, you are, competing with 1.5 of your hands tied behind your back, because some countries in the world, like Vietnam, are already performing at OECD levels, and when they say schooling, they mean education, and some countries are still pushing schooling. And I think get politicians interested about the economic, political, and social future of the country. I think making those salient political issues is hard, but I think it's not impossible, particularly once you've created the information. This is another information question. This is actually a very hard question because one of the key things is by and large, the largest determinant of how successful your child will be in school is you. The school plays some significant role, but not the total role. And what that means is if we grade schools by the performance of their students, we're really just grading parents. And then, surprise, surprise, schools with rich, competent, caring parents are going to look like good schools, and schools that are doing a fantastic job at trying to educate disadvantaged schools will look like bad schools. So I think grading is possible, but I think it's a lot more sophisticated. And second, I think it needs to be richer than just test scores. I'm a big fan of being information on test scores. Tahir has done a very excellent study about the impact on the education market of parents having some information about test scores. So I do think it's super important. But I think when we go to grade schools, we want to grade schools on value added, like how much contribution the schools make, not on, in some sense, the materials they're taking in. Because otherwise elite schools look like good schools, and a lot of elite schools actually aren't good schools. They're just schools with good kids. So I think grading is a really relevant and important thing, and I think countries should move towards making broader public information about a sophisticated grading of schools. Does that make sense? Because I think just the tournament ranking of schools by their test scores, in lots of countries that's publicly available, but in lots of countries that just reveals where rich and privileged kids are going. So, yeah. Yeah. Oh, I couldn't. My hearing's not good even with hearing aids, so.
I don't have a loud voice. Okay. See, my thing was it's to deal with this entire learning crisis and not just the scores. The concepts should be clear. The kids should understand what they're doing. So grading in terms of that, the learning crisis in particular.
No. But I guess what I'm saying is you need both system information and school information. Because without system information of how the overall system is performing, the grading information of schools doesn't necessarily create a positive dynamic. And like I say, we really do, America, my country, having pursued a very, test score centric approach for 10 years, we already know lots of the limitations of that, and you don't need to go down that path. So.
Okay, here.
First of all, I would like to say that this was very reassuring on a personal level, the presentation and how you've gone about learning crisis. So yes, the system is broken, let's say that, and system is not delivering. One question that comes to my mind, and which is being debated a lot in Pakistan, is developing one national curriculum. So my question would be, when you talk about developing one national curriculum and you talk about coherent system,
right.
So do you think that that system should be coherent and one national curriculum will help solve this learning crisis?
Yes, right here.
Hello, so I'm a second year student at SOE and we've studied your publication actually. So my question is that you said and you've established that in most of the developing countries, including Pakistan, the education system is coherent around accessibility and improving accessibility to schooling. And yet we see that still in Pakistan around 22.5 million children are out of school. So what my question is that the government has been, especially in Punjab, they've been doing work on this post 2002, 2003, and yet it's a dilemma that we're still dealing with. So what can the government do to sort of, cover this gap, and then why is it not working in this case, even if there is coherence around increasing accessibility?
Okay. So let's divide let's divide the curriculum into early, middle, and late. So kind of roughly elementary through to 5 to whenever high school starts and high school. I have no ideas and no views on high school curriculum, but doubt that a national curriculum is a super important part of that. On the basic to 5 level, I do think a set of national standards are important. I'm concerned that a typical curriculum reform is going to make things worse, not better. Because a typical curriculum reform ends up like, and this is an American analogy, decorating a Christmas tree. Everybody wants to see their particular ornament on the Christmas tree, and nobody is paying attention to the aesthetic of the overall Christmas tree. So a typical curriculum reform consists of experts on curriculum deciding what an optimal curriculum would look like, independent of its coherence with the finance, information, motivation that we can bring to bear to accomplish the curriculum. So I do think a set of national curricular standards that were conceptually oriented, that by grade 4 a child should understand and be able to demonstrate mastery of the following skills, could be a really important part. But a curriculum that added more subjects, added more topics, added more things without clarity on the depth of mastery and without the necessary simplification is going to make things worse. So for instance, Tanzania in the last few years had a radical curriculum reform that dramatically reduced the number of subjects children were exposed to in grade 1 to 3 in order to get the learning profile on the basic skills steeper, and the indications so far are this really dramatically ramped up performance, because one of the things that is kind of underdocumented is actual time on task. So often you design a curriculum on the presumption there's 220 curricular days, there's 5 hours in each day, there's 1,000 whatever instructional hours. I don't know any information about Pakistan, wouldn't tell you if I did probably, but in middle tier African countries, not completely basket cases, they found that the typical instructional time was about half of what people were planning on. So, the typical African country had about 3 hours and 40 days of planned instructional time, was realizing about an hour and a half. Take an hour and a half a day and divide it into 6 subjects. You're now to complete incoherence between the curriculum and delegation and what's actually achievable. So I think curriculum reform could be important if it moved in the direction of, let's be clear about conceptual mastery about basic skills, and let's acknowledge that in the middle years we're going to build on those skills. So rather than packing all the subjects in grades 1 to 3, let's sort of build out the subjects once we've built a foundation of fluency and literacy, ability to read, basic executive function skills, basic math skills, and etc. So the second question is hard, and there's an analysis we do with what we call enrollment profiles, which is how many of out-of-school kids were in school and aren't in school now, and how many of the out-of-school kids have never been to school. The default assumption in expanding out-of-school children was that they didn't have access to a school. I haven't looked at the data on Pakistan lately. Again, might not tell you if I had. But in many countries, there are lots of out-of-school children who've been to school. Access, in terms of can I make it to a school building, is not the issue if you went to school when you were 6 and you're not going to school when you're 8. Because you can still get to the same school. And hence, I think that a lot of dropout and out-of-school children are school who have dropped out because they know they're not learning anything. Suppose you're in a typical school. Suppose you've gone to school for 4 years and can't read. And your typical school day consists of the teacher walking in, writing on the board, do the exercises in chapter, do the exercises in chapter 4.2 of your social studies workbook. I'd drop out because A, I can't do it, B, not being able to do it makes me embarrassed and shamed, and C, it's just no damn fun. So how much of the out-of-school children is in fact a quality problem, I think is really important. And I think if we got to universal early basic mastery, we would solve a lot of the out-of-school problem because we would retain kids. And I think I haven't done the empirical analysis for Pakistan. So many countries, retention is actually 80% of the out-of-school children. So I don't think these are two separate agendas. And so I don't think saying, since we haven't mopped up access, we shouldn't yet prioritize quality is the right thing. I think prioritizing quality may well be the way to get out-of-school children back in school, rather than, by the way, conditional cash transfers. It's like, you know, I sometimes feel sorry for kids who are in 4th grade, not understanding anything because no one ever paid any attention to actually give them the skills. They drop out, and then somebody comes and says, you know what, we're going to take money away from your mother unless you go back to the school that you hate going to and where you aren't learning anything. It's like, why are... You've got to figure he's got to be puzzled why this is supposedly a good thing, right? So, great.
We do have some evidence in LEAPS on this, right? That the dropout is a function of quality. So I think there is some
and
evidence.
by the way, we also have new evidence, just brand new evidence in the last month or two, that programs that force kids back in school, often they're on a flat learning profile anyway. So literally they just did a scholarship program in Cambodia where they paid kids to go back to school. They went back to school 5 years later. They had no higher learning than the kids who didn't go back to school.
Okay,
They dropped out of school because they weren't learning.
There are lots of hands. I'm going to have some executive privilege. And 1, 2, 3, 4, that's it.
Okay.
Excellent talk. Now, where do we start the reforms? What are the first 3 or 4 reforms you suggest? Is it curriculum? Is it teacher training? It's how do you take it forward?
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for the talk. This evidence is really useful. So my question is very similar to the question that was just got asked. Is I'm currently working on designing a school improvement framework for schools in Punjab. So kind of guilty of what you just said, doing more of the same thing that probably will or won't, like it won't work. But so my question is that, my comment is that the current system works because it benefits everybody. Nobody is losing sleep on the learning crisis. Nobody is losing sleep because of that. And it works for everybody, right? What can be that disruptor that can create the space for a newer system to take that place? And a disruptor that doesn't rely on political will, because that cannot be relied upon for reforms at all times. So what can be that change that can bring in this new system? Thank you.
So that's quite a radical overhaul of the education system. And I was just wondering, how does one then begin to change the discourse? Because more than just sites of education, right? Schools have begun to serve these layers of other social functions as well, right? So how does one work around all of that and then change the discourse?
My question is very basic. How would you define learning? Is it the vehicle? Is it a vehicle or a process of converting information into knowledge? Or how would you define this? Because it seems that the failure seems to be occurring during that process. Something is being delivered but not being received. So what is the fundamental question there? Why is the process, is there a fault with the system or the people who are delivering it?
So let me start with the easiest one. I think, although I've shown you numbers about literacy and numeracy, those are just examples. I just define the process of learning as actually acquiring capabilities. And so, and after all, there's lots of learning outside of schools. I take tennis lessons sometimes to increase my tennis ability. Children take lessons in the Quran to increase their ability to read and understand the Quran. So I think if we just start from a basic, learning is the increasing in the capabilities that a person has to do a variety of things, I think then we realize that exposure, that part of the whole flaw is that we have too easily conflated having been taught with having learned. And learned actually involves a transformation in the learner. Teaching involves the behavior of the teacher, and we've been too focused on creating environments in which teaching is happening, and so we see that the showing is happening, and we haven't really talked about the knowing. But nothing I have said precludes anything being on the learning agenda for Pakistan. I'm, not saying that, national curriculum reform, lots of national values or creativity wouldn't be embedded in the learning, but I think it's a process of change in the learner, right? I think, in some sense, all three of these questions are the same question, and I think there'd be, I would have a different answer probably for most countries than for Pakistan. Because for most countries, I would start with information about actual performance as being the thin end of the wedge to drive in to expand concern. Because in many countries, they've never participated in an international assessment. They haven't had reliable information about performance, and so a large part of the complacency is let's continue with business as usual expansion of the usual cell-by-cell teacher training, curricular stuff, and we're delusional about what the actual learning performance is. I think, and this is one thing I will say about Pakistan, Pakistan's well beyond that. I don't think Pakistan might have 15 years ago been kind of delusional about what learning performance is. I think through the efforts of Asr and others, most people in Pakistan who are concerned about the issue of all are aware. So I think the place to start, frustratingly, is delegation to generate coherence. And what I mean by delegation is we actually need a national and provincial dialogue that squarely identifies the current gaps in learning and then demand of each of the priorities how they are addressing that gap in a way that's coherent around an overall agenda. Because again, the temptation for every field to break down into cell by cell, I'm doing teacher training, I'm doing assessment, is just overwhelming unless it can be overridden by a high priority sense of, no, we're really trying to accomplish this objective, and if you can't tell me not only how your reform or element or project influences it, but how it is coherent with other reforms we are taking, then we need to have that conversation. Because I think what's happening in Pakistan is there are lots of people working on education reforms of various types, but as of yet, I think they have yet to really cohere around a prioritization on a clear agenda that could be characterized as a curricular set of standards that everyone across the citizens, the business associations, the politicians understood that we were working for. And then I just learned a great phrase this morning in a way that allows people to start tracking, not targeting learning performance. And the reason I track, not target, and I don't know if the person who told me that this morning is here today. But because we do want to track it. We need to make it high stakes. We need to make it visible. We need to keep track of how we're doing. But I think Pakistan has learned the lesson of targeting. If you make it a high stakes target, it very quickly becomes a delivered target on paper, and you force a disjunction between the reality and you undermine motivation and everything else. So I think, unfortunately, the way to start is sort of national dialogue or provincial level dialogue around delegation. What is it that we can agree across all the relevant actors are the key objectives of learning for the early grades, and let's focus our efforts over the next X years around achieving that. Thank you very much.
So, Salman, to take it forward, right? So in Punjab right now, we are having a discussion on reforming teacher training. We are having a discussion on reforming assessments. we're having a discussion on monitoring and mentoring, and these are all three separate discussions. And I think that delegation part, I think, is something that one can actually bring coherence to it. Ladies and gentlemen, Lant has been here for the last few days, and you can imagine the kinds of conversations we have been having in the School of Education with students, with faculty, with staff, with policymakers on assessments, on monitoring and information. It has really been Lant. It has been just a rich few days having you here. He's been on. I love what I love about Lant, and I've known him since graduate school, is you can stop him at anywhere, anything he is doing, and if you want to talk about learning, he will just stop, and you will have to stop him talking about it. It's really nice for you to be at LUMS, and I think his commitment towards thinking about issues of learning, poverty, and also Lant is modest. He knows a lot about Pakistan, and has been thinking deeply about these concerns. So it has been really great few days, and I'd like to thank you all for coming and for being there. And I'd like now the Vice Chancellor Rashid to just kind of close the session.
All right. Well, let me also echo my thank you to you, Professor Lant Pritchett. It's an honor to have you here and to hear some of your thoughts this evening. A couple of things I will say. First of all, is this room. There are many occasions where we have speakers come from abroad or within Pakistan with the expertise they bring, and there are only seldom occasions like these when the room gets packed as it has. And on both occasions, at least in my memory, both of the topics were on learning. Barbara Oakley was here not so long ago, and this room was packed, and the same thing is happening here today. I'm very grateful to Tahir, of course, to Mariam, many others in the School of Education, and you can see all the supporters here that Tahir mentioned, so a big thank you for you as well. The last thing I'll say is that the conversations we're having at LUMS in the last year and a half, and I know this has been building up from many years before, is the idea that learning is not belonging in any particular space, but it really has no borders. And just you can see that in this room, that there's a cross-section of people here representing many different parts of the society that are hungry for learning, and that motivation factor is already here. So what we want to do in institutions like LUMS, and I know there are many others at various levels, is to break down those walls and borders so we can have conversations with people having very different perspectives, so that we can talk about scaling solutions that may be happening in pockets all over the place, but we need to have those conversations which you've encouraged very much. So I want to thank you again, Lant, and thank everyone else for joining us today. It was great to see you here, and please come again.
Oh, and there is some tea and biscuits outside, so please help yourself. Thank you very much.